In order to have what you really want, you must first be who you really are. Tim S. Grover. This next season of the ShiftEQ podcast is going to question and then reframe how we've been conditioned and how to empower ourselves through it. The goal for the season is for all of us to be made aware of such societal constructs such as labels, impressions, mindsets, and conditioning for which we've all been programmed. And then either break through it if it doesn't serve us or reframe it so that we can create the best version of ourselves. The best version of yourself, as I would define it, is by taking control of your fucking life and then going after everything that you've ever wanted, authentically and unapologetically. That's why if I were to label my life right now, it would be that of transcendence. Why? Because identifying myself as such enables me to not only invest into myself constantly, but also to be open to change and perspective. The world is changing every day, and I prefer to change with it and constantly create a better life for me, because I honestly believe that happiness and fulfillment are meant to be enjoyed and experienced regularly, not just when an accomplishment or an accolade is met. I have found that it is the pursuit of these things, aka my higher self, that make life worth living, and I have set my life to the transcendent mindset that I have just described. But I'll be honest, this mindset, as empowering and liberating as it might be, came with a lot of fucking work and even more unconditioning and then reconditioning myself to finally understand who I really am and then pursue what I really want. Before I get into this episode, let me explain what conditioning is. Conditioning is just that. Being conditioned to either think, respond, react, or even behave based on circumstance. It can be as simple as always eating desserts after dinner or having a cigarette every time you drink, to even deeper responses and mindsets, such as constantly being in relationships with emotionally unavailable people because of your lack thereof a relationship with someone in your childhood. Whatever it is, we all have them, and they all are the root of how our lives are dictated. And the only way we take control of our lives and create the best and highest version of ourselves is to be aware of those said conditions and then work on how they affect our thoughts, feelings, and actions. When it comes to the human experience and how we're conditioned, it's developed in 5 different relationships. You with the world with you, your relationship with your community, and your relationship of the community with you. And then lastly, then most importantly, is your relationship with yourself. I, like anyone else, have had a numerous amount of labels that condition me to behave or think in a certain manner and not exactly define who I am, but rather show me who that is. Those labels include, but are not exclusive to, father, son, brother, friend, military, nuclear engineer, poker player, commentator, podcaster, influencer. But all of them pale in comparison to that of the Asian American male label and then therefore experience. I know it seems like the popular thing right now. And even though my name is Alan, I'll be frank with you, I'm speaking about this because we are finally being listened to. We are finally being allowed to claim racism when for years it didn't feel like it felt like racism was a privilege to claim, and that privilege wasn't allowed by Asian people. That's one of the things about being Asian. We've been marginalized in media and society so much that up until recently, we weren't good enough to be white, the status of it at least, nor were we suffering enough to be a minority. My race has been so marginalized and projected to be weak, passive, timid, and soft-spoken to the point where if I were a bully, why not choose an Asian person? Why? Because it's easy to bully and pick on people who society believes to be timid, weak, and passive. I'm going to go over my experience as an Asian American male in 3 different parts. First being the conditioning and discrimination that I was introduced to as a kid that initially set the foundation for the conditioning. How that conditioning affected my life, my adult life, and all the way through the time that I was in the Navy for all my nuke buddies, CB-807. And then now, for which I've been able to detach myself from that label altogether. This isn't going to be an easy episode to listen to. I'm going to be very honest and vulnerable with it all. Some things are going to be downright uncomfortable to hear and experience. But that's okay. I've accepted that life happens for us and not to us. And I'm beyond grateful for my experiences. Why? Because without them, I would have never done the work to get me to this point and have the perspective that I do now. With that being said, welcome to the second season of the ShiftEQ.Podcast. It's important for me to preface this episode with two things. First, this is my experience and what I saw, right? I don't want this to be the poster boy story for every Asian American that experienced what they did during their childhood. This is just what I saw, what I felt. And this is also for you guys to actually understand and feel, so you guys can understand the conditioning, the behaviors that go along with it, so that you guys can also reflect those different labels and conditionings within your lives and be able to reframe it like I have been able to do. And number two, although I am Korean, all of this episode is going to be about being Asian American and the Asian American experience. Why? Because to this day, the American society as a whole hasn't done the due diligence to be able to humanize us and be able to tell us apart from our different ethnicities. So from the basic Asian American rhetoric, or the American rhetoric against Asian Americans, I am Chinese. I'm also Japanese. I'm also all of the above, because we're all categorized in one group. That's why when COVID was labeled the Chinese virus, it wasn't wrong because the virus did come from China. It was wrong because we as an American population, one, haven't figured out that being American doesn't mean being white. Go back to where it came from is about as intolerant as it gets. And we still haven't taken the time and the effort to, like what I just said, to teach the different ethnicities within the Asian race. It pretty much gets ignored. And because of this, every single Asian and all Asian Americans are labeled as Chinese. So when you say the virus is from China, people are still programmed and conditioned to assume it's all Asians. Again, when all of a sudden everybody thinks that this timid, passive group of people that aren't assertive are the reasons for all these deaths that are happening in the world, it's really easy to pick on them and feel righteous about yourself. Ignorant as shit, right? Up until recently, Asian men were regularly displayed in media as timid, passive, geeky, and unattractive, all of which, as a kid, I did not want to identify with. And hell, now I don't want to identify with. Doesn't matter what age I am, right? But here's a catch about being the Asian in a white family. Everyone saw the contrast, and the contrast was pointed out every time we were in public. Diversity and interracial families were barely being acceptable in the 90s. And I'm not saying that it was illegal, I'm saying socially acceptable. And very similarly to how we're transitioning to accepting and being tolerant of the LGBTQ community, the same approach was being had towards diverse couples and diverse families. Now, in a time where I wasn't exactly 100% comfortable with who I was in my foster family, I was introduced to a world where it was telling me that I'm second rate, not masculine, or desired. This narrative was perpetuated even more in my local community/society. Azusa, where I lived at the time, was either Mexican or was white. I mean, at the time, I was one of probably 3 Asian kids in the entire school. And those 2 other Asian kids were bullied and picked on by everyone else. Because of this, it made me feel like I had to prove myself. And the way that started shaping my childhood and the things I started getting into, I started doing things that most Asians wouldn't do, like play sports and lift weights. But even then, like when I played games like basketball, I was always told Asians don't make it in the NBA. This is before Yao Ming, before Jeremy Lin. But this is also why, even though Jeremy Lin had lack thereof of an NBA career per se, per stats, what he did for the Asian American community is absolutely a blessing, and why he's still beloved to this day about it. It just happens to be an amazing humanitarian as well, and that's why we're all grateful for Jeremy Lin. But the other one I also used to get, now that I'm a owner of a health coaching business, is that there's no such thing as buff Asians. So no matter what I did, no matter what I tried to pursue physically as a man, as a male, I was always made to feel second rate of myself. And I actually heard it so much and so often, and I never saw like big, ripped Asian men. I actually believed it was against our genetics, like I was told. Really did believe it. It wasn't until this Japanese American bodybuilder by the name of Ken Yasuda that I saw him on a Muscle and Fitness magazine, and I finally realized, holy shit, it was just a limiting belief. I didn't call it a limiting belief, but you get it. I didn't realize it was possible until then, and that's what actually got me into working out a lot more seriously. Now, when it came to dating, right, now I'll just talk about the physical. When it comes to dating, since we were portrayed as not being sexy or desired, it was assumed that we were all ugly. I mean, as a matter of fact, when I was 7, I was in a summer day camp and I was put off with all the guys. This group of girls walked past us and they're like, oh my God, all you guys are fine with the exception of the Asian. Except the Asian. Except the Asian. And I know that's really fucked up, right? But back in the 90s, that was okay. That was okay. It was okay to socially degrade Asian male men because it was what was portrayed in media. It was portrayed as a stereotype for all of us. I mean, to this day, I still have some Asian friends, both men and women, that refuse to date our own kind. Our own kind. As if we're like a fucking species or something. And it's so crazy on how we have been marginalized and now we're marginalizing ourselves, and then we're still doing it today and all the other things that we do. And to be honest too, I mean, I look back at it now, there were times where I would hook up with girls that were outside of my ethnicity, my race, and they would just like, you're my first Asian, right? Like, what the fuck is that even supposed to mean? But after a while, and after you hear it for a while, you just somehow take it to your ego. At least I did. And we just think that becomes a positive trait, I mean, back then, and even sometimes now, the unwritten Asian American rule is that if you either date or even hang out with a different race as an Asian person, that you are validated as a person and no longer are just Asian. It's one of those weird mindsets that I saw, for which I saw a lot of my Asian friends, to include myself, kind of put ourselves down in some manner and act like we're better than our own kind, and it was a really, really fucked up mindset if you really think about how you can make people feel more of themselves by being less of themselves. And I know that mindset and that approach was happening to a lot of Asian Americans at that time. And just like I was saying, just like the whole, hey, you're my first Asian, as I got older, as I started working out, as I started getting more attractive and starting more confident, it was then I was starting getting compliments. Oh, hey, you're handsome, but for an Asian. Oh, you are good looking and muscular for an Asian, for an Asian, for an Asian. And to this day, I still hear for an Asian all the fucking time. And people don't even know that they're doing that. And subconsciously, it makes people feel less of themselves, while the people who are using it are subconsciously marginalizing the other and making themselves like they're superior in some manner. Again, most people don't even realize that they've been programmed to view Asian people as such. And to be honest with you, I wouldn't know any different unless, because it's done to me. That's why I know. That's exactly why, when 9/11 happened and everything that everybody that pictured and stereotyped Middle Eastern people as terrorists in its entirety because of what the media did. We have to understand that these conditionings exist. And here's another thing about being Asian and the whole Asian stereotype. Not only are we programmed to view Asian Americans, lower Asian people as a general whole, but if you have an accent, so help me God, you get treated so much fucking worse. It's crazy because we live in a society that views multilingual people as intelligent, unless it's that of Asian descent. People have been taught to make fun of the Asian accent completely, the L's into the R's. Two whites don't make a Wong. I remember that shirt being on an Abercrombie and Fitch shirt, or American Eagle, I forgot which one of those. And people have been made it taught, just make fun of Asians and the Asian accent, fully neglecting the fact that this is sometimes English is their second and even third language. The good but not good enough marginalization is something that I grew up with and saw, to the point where, like I just described before, I started to marginalize myself. Always going after what I wanted, but then accepting a second-rate result, or dating women and then not being fully vulnerable with them because ultimately I didn't believe I was worthy enough to be accepted and loved. Now, I am the only one responsible for making myself feel as such. And I could have pulled myself out of this mindset at any time. But at that time, I didn't know any better. All this working on yourself, finding your authenticity, being able to understand programming and conditioning wasn't around 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago. Wow, I just feel like I dated myself. I was taught to internalize all of my anger, all of my pain. And again, I was impressed upon that as an Asian, I could never speak about racism or talk about being treated less. Because again, in the culture, it was just assumed that you do, and therefore you got to take it. To this day, it seems like it's still socially acceptable to make Asian jokes, like Asian math jokes, Asian small dick jokes, Asian bad driving jokes. And it's so hypocritical, in my opinion, because if you were to make a racist comment about any other race, any other ethnicity, or you to make a comment about someone's sexuality, that shit gets canceled right on the fucking spot, and it's considered to be ridiculously insensitive. But when you make an Asian joke, for some reason it's just acceptable, and it's okay. Now, the narrative of that is changing, but for the most part, it's still very prevalent in today's culture. Now, by the time I got to my senior year of high school, I was actually finally established with regards to my identity. But here's the thing. My identity was the exceptional Asian guy in school. All my friends were black. I played football. I was in shape. I was actually social. I went to parties. And that's how I was known. That's where my popularity, my identity came from. Like, hey, he's Asian, but he's not your normal Asian. Without even realizing how marginalizing that is, I just ran with it. For someone who struggled with their identity, someone who struggled with accepting themselves for who they were, as soon as I get accepted for a persona, I just fucking ran with it. Because it finally made me feel good. It made me feel confident. Mind you, it was a very false sense of confidence. But at least at the time, and at least for that year, it was something that I definitely identified with and was confident with. After that, though, after high school, That's when I started realizing, hey, maybe I should actually be myself, and all this Asian marginalism and everything isn't going to serve me. But it really didn't take until I joined the Navy to understand what that really meant. Thank you guys for joining me on this episode of the first episode of the first season after the first season. The next episode is going to be highlighting that Asian American experience in the Navy, and also how I broke through a lot of those marginalized thoughts, at least about myself, so that I can break through into where I'm at now. But stay tuned. That's going to go on next week. Thank you all for supporting the channel. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next week. Deuce.